Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the Mesh Tsunami podcast. This week, we were offering 5 conversations from episode 18. Our discussion with Society for Sober Livers founder and visionary Jenn Jones and principal strategic advisor Beth Lehman, talking about HOPE, their new support program for people who have harmed their bodies through alcohol use disorder, or AUD, either active, which means still consuming alcohol, or in remission, which means sober, at least at this time. By the way, HOPE stands for Healing Others with Peers and Education. This conversation focuses on the target population of active or in remission AUD patients living with decompensated cirrhosis and asks why this group needs a support community like HOPE. It begins with me asking what makes people who have harmed their bodies through AUD a unique community. Beth and Jenn explain that the lifelong medical challenges associated with being post-transplant or living with cirrhosis create unique needs and challenges that traditional recovery programs do not address. I go on to describe a friend who was found on his bathroom floor vomiting blood and ask whether this person is a good candidate for HOPE. Jenn describes why that case is so serious and indicates the answer is yes. Beth adds that this person might not have addressed the behavior patterns that led him to overconsume alcohol, which would put him at risk of relapse and therefore in need of many kinds of support. HOPE is an admirable and ambitious effort to provide support that does not otherwise exist today for people who need it badly. Personal stories that Jenn and Beth share are compelling and their plans and goals invigorating. So just sit back, listen, learn, absorb. When you're done, check out our LinkedIn discussion group and check out and perhaps contribute to soberlivers.org to support HOPE. What about the idea that you are people who've harmed your bodies makes you a different population within the 12-step community than, say, people who've been drinking forever but either haven't harmed their bodies or aren't aware that they've harmed their bodies?
Beth Lehman.
Well, you bring up a good point there because I do think there's a lot of people out there that haven't realized the depths that they've harmed their bodies. But when you have liver disease because of alcohol, you've got a whole nother set of complications, right? So a lot of the conversations are around procedures that you have to have. You know, they say, okay, look at his beer gut. That's actually a symptom, fluid in your belly. If we're sick, we have to go and get, a procedure done to have that removed. It's so nice to be able to talk to people that have to do the different medical appointments that you have to do and the medications that you have to take when you have liver disease. And that's someone that has not gotten to the point where their bodies are failing, would not necessarily have in common with a transplant recipient or a pre-transplant patient. But the one thing, and Jenn, don't hate me, I'm going to use the word, but Jenn hates it when I use the word alcoholic because, and I think alcoholic is a very personal word. Some people choose to use it, some people don't choose to use it. Jenn, what is your term? What do you use?
Jenn Jones.
I'm a person in remission from alcohol use disorder, long-term remission.
Right.
Takes a lot more discipline to say that one, but go ahead.
Yeah, I take the easy way out. I was using a lot of words before. Now I'm going to stick to one. But that part is the same with everybody. If you have the disease of alcohol use disorder, you have the same disease. Now let's just take it a step further. And, I kind of coin it together with, we would be great in a recovery program for women, right? I'm a woman. I would be in a women's group, right? But then let's just say that they have a group for farmers. And I'm using that because I know that there's a dating show on TV about farmers. And then let's just say they take that group and they divide it down into farmers with chickens, farmers with horses, and farmers with goats. Those are all subcategories that do exist in a recovery program. And I actually asked them the question, what about a subcategory of people that have had a transplant? And they didn't want to touch it. And I think it's because it's medical. There's a lot of terminology and they don't want to try and be known as a substitute for the medical physician, which we are very strong in that Sober Livers is not a substitute for your medical physician. However, we've been through all the same procedures. We take the same medications. We're not going to give you dosage. We're not going to give you advice to contradict what your doctor says, but we can talk you through it because more than likely somebody on the Sober Livers group meeting has been through what you are up against. And that's the biggest difference.
So help me. This is kind of gets to my question. I have a friend who I want to say 3 years ago, his partner, thin, healthy, smiling, laughing guy. 3 years ago, his partner came in and found him on the floor throwing up blood. And at the end of the story, it turned out that he was Child's Pugh. Now, they've been able to manage that so far with medication, and he's gone to drinking non-alcoholic beer, and he seems to be fine. I'm wondering how far, when you say people have done damage to their bodies, are we talking about people have gotten to the point where, would he constitute, in your mind, someone who's done damage to his body, or do you have to go somewhere past that? How are we defining that term?
Well, I do think it's subjective. I think that if you are to the point of throwing up blood, then that certainly qualifies you. Jenn, you had more of the cirrhotic type symptoms where I kind of went straight into the cancer symptoms. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's a great question. And number one, what you're talking about, a varices bleed, is so incredibly dangerous and very scary for people to think about. I know from my own experience, it's one of the scariest parts that I think about that could happen to me is throwing up blood, because if you don't make it to the hospital very quickly, you will die. So they have what's called compensated cirrhosis and decompensated cirrhosis. And when you go into a decompensation stage, which is where I was at when I ended up in the hospital in 2018, that means you have the ascites, or the fluid in the belly that Beth was talking about earlier. You have varices, large varices in your throat that could, or esophagus, that could pop at any time if they're not banded during an endoscopy, where a doctor goes in with a camera and basically takes a look at how big those varices are and bands them. So your friend that you're speaking of, that's a very troubling sign, and it's a very troubling symptom of a decompensation event that has happened to his liver. So my recommendation is definitely that you need to be with a hepatologist. You need to get an MRI, see how far along you are. You know, they have really great MRIs right now. They can tell you a lot more many times than a biopsy can. I would say, yeah, drinking non-alcohol beer is one approach, but non-alcohol beer still has alcohol in it. So it would be much better to choose another option for your drink of choice. But quitting drinking is hard. And I've talked to a lot of physicians about harm reduction lately. And so it's like, what can we do to get people to get to a sober point or get to that abstinence? Because the liver will regenerate, but once it's cirrhotic, like I have right now, it's considered recompensated, meaning it went from a decompensated state to a compensated state. But that's as far as I can go right now, because there are no treatments outside of abstinence or a transplant. Those are the only two treatments that are currently available outside of the new treatment for steatotic liver for people who have metabolic dysfunction, but it isn't good for people with alcohol.
And remembering, by the way, that most of this audience is an audience of health professionals and corporate execs.
So they know what we're talking about. We can use the terminology.
Which is why I went straight to Child's Pew B. Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, if I could jump in, and that's actually what I had. The other thing about the non-alcoholic beers and the non-alcoholic wines and things like that, for a true person with alcohol use disorder, it's the whole package, right? So drinking that non-alcoholic beer mimics a behavior, and that is a behavior pattern that is synonymous with drinking and drinking too much. So you want to be careful when trying to drink these non-alcoholic beers and all that, but like Jen said, they do have a certain percentage of alcohol in them, that you are not trying to use it as a substitute, because if you are, then you haven't really looked at the behavior and why you're doing it. You know, I actually went through extensive therapy, and I had to before they would put me on the list for transplant to make sure that I was serious about changing my behavior. So I just want to put a caution out there about those non-alcoholic drinks if you do have a problem.
And now back to Roger.
I hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingmash.com. Over this week, we will be posting a series of one-on-one conversations I had with some of our friends over the course of the EASL Congress, and then a wrap-up with Jorn, Louise, and me later in the week. We will have other EASL conversations throughout the month. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.